Jen.
And I'm Bailey. We're from the Middendorf-Cradell branch. Thank you for joining us for the library's How To Festival. Today we're going to show you how to make your very own scrunchies in 2 different ways.
One way we'll use traditional elastic like this, and the other we'll use a hair tie like this. It's pretty easy once you get into the scrunchie groove, so let's get started.
Here are the materials that we will be using to make scrunchies. We're going to use a strip of fabric to make the scrunchie, and the size of the strip can vary depending on your personal preference and what you want the finished scrunchie to look like. The type of fabric can also vary because many different kinds of fabric will work well for scrunchies, from something like a soft knit fabric to something like velvet or denim. This plaid flannel in the picture is actually from a shirt that I cut up, so it's a great way to reuse some fabric as well. And if you're using a fabric that has a pattern on it, you may want to think about the scale and size of the pattern. Smaller scale patterns might show up a little bit better when they're sewn and scrunched up. Another great thing to buy for scrunchies is called a fat quarter. It's a pre-cut piece of fabric, and they come in lots of different colors and patterns and are available at a lot of different stores. And you should be able to get a few scrunchies out of one. Next up is elastic or a hair tie. Again, we're going to show you methods that use both just the regular elastic and the hair ties that are already in a loop. And if you're using regular elastic, we recommend using 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch wide. Next up, you'll need something to cut your fabric. You can use a rotary cutter if you have that, or fabric scissors. Then you'll need something to measure your fabric with. Something like a ruler would work fine, because that can also give you a straight edge for cutting your fabric. Then you need something to mark your fabric with, like a pencil or pen. And you can also use the eraser of the pencil to turn your fabric right side out, which we'll have to do for these scrunchies. And on that note, you'll want a tube turner or a safety pin. It's just something that will help you turn your tube of fabric right side out. And a safety pin can also help you insert the elastic into the fabric tube, which we'll show. And actually for this video, we're using a paper clip. And you'll want some straight pins as well to help hold that fabric when it's folded. And then not pictured here, but pretty obvious, is that we're going to use a sewing machine, or you can use a needle and thread at home if you don't have a machine. And you may want your thread to match your fabric or kind of blend in with it, but it's up to you.
Alright, so first up we're going to show you how to make a scrunchie using regular elastic. And the first step, of course, is to measure and cut your fabric and elastic. For this tutorial, for both tutorials, we're using fabric that's cut to about 4 inches wide and 20 inches long. And then I'm going to be using a piece of elastic that's 10 inches long, because eventually I'm going to tie this together, so I want to leave enough space so that it's big enough for my scrunchie. And what's really nice about this is your cutting doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight. If you're using scraps, you can do like 2 pieces together to get your length long enough, and that would be fine. Because you think about it, it's going to be a scrunchie. It's going to be all scrunched up anyway, so don't worry about it being too perfect. And the length and width of the fabric can vary also with the elastic for different size scrunchies. So you just have to think about how big you want your final scrunchie to be. If you do a wider piece of fabric, it's going to be a wider scrunchie, more like this pink one. It's pretty wide. Or you can even do a skinnier one. I think this one is pretty skinny. So it's really up to you how you want your final scrunchie to look. Alright, so I'm using a printed fabric, so it has a right side and a wrong side. And the next step is to fold your fabric in half long ways with the right sides together. So like this. So you're going to fold that and then you'll pin it so that we can sew it together. Alright, so we have our piece that's folded and pinned, right sides together, so the wrong side is facing out. And the next step is to sew along this edge that we just pinned. And we're going to do that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're also going to leave about an inch of space at each end that won't be sewn. And you're going to see why in just a little bit. And then you'll also want to remember to do some back stitching at the beginning and the end just to secure those stitches. So I'm leaving a little bit of space, about an inch. And that part's done. Okay, so next we're going to need to turn this fabric right side out so we have a nice, beautiful polka dot scrunchie. So you're going to need something to help you do that. You can use like a safety pin, or if you have a tube turner, if you do some other sewing, you might have one of those. I'm actually going to be using a paper clip. It can also just kind of go through the fabric. So you put it through on the end. And you can go ahead and start feeding it into the tube of fabric. And you kind of are able to hold on to the paper clip as you scrunch the fabric up to turn it inside out. And when you get close enough to the end, you can grab that paper clip or whatever you're using and pull it through, and then it'll be right side out. And I'm going to hold on to the fabric and not the paper clip so it doesn't rip out. Here we go. So I'll go ahead and take that paper clip out. So now that we have our nice tube of fabric that is right side out, it's time to feed this elastic through the tube. So we're going to do a similar method. I'm going to use a paper clip, but you can use a safety pin as well. And it does poke through. Okay. So I'm going to start feeding it through, but I also don't want this other end to disappear inside this fabric, so I'm going to have to hold on to it while I do this. You can also pin this end to your fabric so it doesn't get lost, but I'm just going to hold it. So now this elastic has come out the other side. I can take the paper clip off. And you can kind of see our scrunchie is starting to take shape and getting that nice scrunched look. So the next step is to join these pieces of elastic together. I'm going to do that by tying. You can also sew them together. But I'm just going to tie them together like this. Bring them together. Alright, that's a pretty strong knot. Alright. Okay, so this is what we have. Our elastic and an almost finished scrunchie, but we're going to need to finish these edges and sew them together. And I'm going to do that without sewing through this elastic. So I'm going to kind of tuck this knot out of the way. And I'll sort of turn the fabric. And what I'm going to do, we're going to be sewing these shorter edges together, like the ends of the tube that we had. We're sewing these together. But they need to be sewn with the right sides together so that is a nice seam when it's finished. Let me get that knot out of the way. Okay. And I'm going to pin this together to hold it because it can get kind of tricky. And if you're doing a wider piece of fabric, you can leave more room unsewn. I left about 1 inch, but if you're doing wider than a 4-inch piece of fabric, you can make this even longer. Give yourself some more room to work with. So let me go ahead and pin this together. I think the finishing can be the trickiest part of making these, so if you need to just kind of play around with it till you figure it out, that's totally okay. I did the same thing. I'm going to be careful not to sew through all of this extra fabric. I'm just going to try and sew these edges together. So I'll do one more pin. Alright, so there we have our edge that we're sewing together. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so now this is all sewn together. We can kind of tuck it in. There it is, it's nice and neat. So the last step is to sew this together, this kind of side seam. So all we do for that is tuck the fabric in, and then we're going to sew it closed, just so it kind of blends in with the rest of that seam. So I'm going to do a pin in that. And I'm going to sew it pretty close to this edge, as close as I can. for this one, we used a thread that contrasts with the fabric more, kind of makes it easier for you to see what we were doing. But you can always do a thread that will blend in with the fabric better. But yeah, now we have a finished scrunchie. You can kind of scrunch it around how you want. This one's nice and big for my thick hair, so I'm really excited to get to use it.
So now we're going to do the scrunchie method that uses a hair tie, and it's a little bit trickier to sew it, but it's great for if you don't have any elastic on hand. Just make sure that the hair tie that you're using is good quality, like this one. Give it a few test stretches. You want to make sure that it doesn't just snap and break after you've put all that hard work into making your scrunchie, and then it just snaps when it's in your hair. So if you're also keep in mind if you have thick hair, you probably want to buy the kind that's meant for thick hair. If you have fine hair like me, you can just use the kind of regular kind. And then once again, you're going to use a strip of fabric that's about 4 inches by 20, but it doesn't have to be exactly that size and it doesn't have to be perfectly cut. That's just our kind of starting point. And then similar to what Bailey did on the elastic method, the end goal here is that you're going to fold it lengthwise, right sides together, the pretty sides together, but instead of sewing it into one long tube and then putting in the elastic, we have to, since it's already a circle, we have to kind of sew it into a tube, but with the elastic inside of it. So that's the tricky part. So I'm going to go ahead and get this set up. Just like with the previous method, you want to leave at least an inch of the beginning of the tube that you're creating, and you want to leave it so that you have room to sew that final stitch closed. Okay. So again, just like with the previous one, we want to do 1/4 inch seam allowances. And we want to make sure that we back stitch at the beginning and the end to really secure that seam so that it doesn't come apart as soon as you stretch it to put it in your hair. Alright, now it's pretty easy. It's easier once you get it started, but basically what I'm doing is I'm going to kind of scrunch as I sew. So I'm going to feed a little bit more in and make sure that my edges are lined up here. I'm kind of just doing like an inch at a time, basically. Everything that's back behind the presser foot here, I'm kind of scrunching. So here we are, about 1.5 inches or so from the end of the strip of fabric. So I'm just gonna back stitch. And take it out. All right, there we have it. So, of course, now we have the wrong side of the fabric facing out. So we need to flip it, flip the whole tube of fabric around itself. So you're essentially going to just be doing this and pulling it through. If you have a piece of fabric that's at least 4 inches wide, you can probably just do this by hand, or you could use like the safety pin or paper clip or tube turner method that Bailey mentioned. All right, so we're finally at the end here. It's all right side out. And that takes some time and some patience, but it's, it can be fun. Just don't let yourself get frustrated. It's a great thing to sit and do while you're watching TV or listening to an audiobook. Just kind of hanging out indoors as the weather gets colder. So I'm going to make sure that it's not twisted. So I'm going to kind of match the seam up with the elastic here, so that I don't sew it shut with the fabric twisted. All right, and then the rest of it is the same as the method that Bailey demonstrated. So we're going to kind of flip these around for a second and sew the right sides of the short ends of the fabric strip together like this, with this little elastic just kind of out of the way. So I'm going to pin half of it to help me keep my bearings here. And we're going to, again, do 1/4 inch seam allowance and make sure you backstitch. And then you just turn that seam to the inside. You can cut all those threads. I'm just going to kind of tuck them in there. And then we just have to close up this last little bit of the gap. You're just going to fold it under. Maybe kind of match up with the edge here. And then we're going to sew as close to the edge of the scrunchie as we can. Because you want to make sure that you are catching these little flaps of fabric that you just turned under. And if your thread matches the fabric, even better, because it'll hide it even more. This method is great because you don't have to sew through that really thick hair tie elastic, because that can be hard on your machine, if it'll even go through. I don't think mine would. There you have it. So we would just cut those little threads off and fluff it around. And there's your scrunchie.
Thank you so much for watching Jen and I make some scrunchies. We hope y'all have as much fun as we did making tons of cool scrunchies for your wardrobe.